There was a holdup of historic proportions at New York City's Kennedy Airport this morning. Several $1 million in cash and jewelry taken from a cargo hangar by a band of armed men wearing masks.
It's theorized the 5 to 7 ski mask gunmen cut the...
On December 11th, 1978, the biggest robbery in U.S. history took place, the Lufthansa heist. It was the perfect robbery, and the mastermind behind it was the Irish gangster, Jimmy the Gent Burke.
Jimmy Burke was a throwback. You know, the way he made money was the old way gangsters did, and that is through extortion and hijackings and insignificant robberies like the Lufthansa robbery.
For over 30 years, Jimmy Burke was one of the most feared and respected criminals in New York City. He was a legend on the streets, and the basis for Robert De Niro's character in the film Goodfellas. It was a film that showed the relationship between Burke and the gangster Henry Hill.
No one fucked with Jimmy Burke because he was the most fucking vicious motherfucker you ever met in your life. You know, he'd pat you on the fucking back and stick a fucking ice pick in your head.
Jimmy Burke was born in New York in 1931. His mother, Mary Conway, was originally from Dublin. Burke's father abandoned her before Jimmy was born, and she was unable to raise the infant on her own. When he was only 2 years old, she left him in an orphanage. It was a tough upbringing, being sent from foster home to foster home all over the city. His rough upbringing would have a major impact on him.
Burke, he was really on his own, and you know, he grew up in circumstances in which being a tough guy was the important thing to be. And that's what he was. He was very tough. He was, you know, he could handle himself in fights and on the streets. And very early on, he gravitated towards the world of organized crime and being a gangster.
By the time Jimmy Burke was 18 years old, he was already established with Italian mobster Dominic Serimo, known as Remo, who worked out of Robert's Lounge in Queens. Burke began to steal all sorts of goods, and Remo was happy to buy them from him. But that wasn't their only racket. Remo would also send Jimmy to cash false checks for him. They continued the scam until Burke was caught and sentenced to 5 years in prison in 1949. Before he went to prison, Burke got a battering from the police. They tried to make him implicate Remo in the operation, but Burke wouldn't speak. His loyalty won him the respect of the mafia, and he began working for them while he was on the inside.
You got to remember, he was a child of the institution. So you send someone like Jimmy Burke to a place like a prison, he's going to use it as if he was going off to college. He's going to form alliances and relationships that he's going to immediately put to use once he's back in civilian society.
When Burke was released in 1954, he was a hardened criminal. He returned to New York and headed straight for Robert's Lounge, where Remo was waiting for him. Remo rewarded him for his loyalty by signing over the deeds to the lounge. Now, Jimmy Burke had his own headquarters. Robert's Lounge was on the edge of Queens, far removed from the real action in the city centre. But things changed in the mid-1950s as building started on Idlewild Airport, on Jimmy Burke's doorstep.
Well, Jimmy Burke was a hijacker. That was one of his main sources of revenue as a criminal. He hijacked trucks, he hijacked freight coming in at the airports, Idlewild Airport, which was the airport that was there in Queens, and sort of built a reputation for himself that way. And he became affiliated with a faction of the mafia known as the Lucchese family. And the reason they liked working with him is he was an earner. The thing that distinguished Jimmy Burke was his ability to generate income. He was always scheming and thinking about criminal scams that he could pull off, from the low level to the grandiose.
Now that Burke was connected with the Lucchese family, he formed a crew with two of them, Tommy DeSimone and Henry Hill.
Well, we were like a crew, the three of us, like the three Stooges, you know what I mean? Me, Jimmy, and Tommy. Made a lot of money together. A lot of fucking money. Me and Jimmy, he was like my older brother. I mean, he was a legend back then. Sinatra, when he used to come into town, Sinatra wanted to always be with Jimmy. You know, Sammy Davis, Sinatra, all those dudes, Diana Ross, all those people. Everybody knew Jimmy. And Tommy, he could have been a fucking actor if he was, normal. But he was a homicidal fucking maniac. He used to put notches in his fucking pistols. He had 32 or 33 fucking notches in his fucking silver with pearl-handled pistols. Tommy two guns, that's what he used to go on.
By the mid-1960s, Idlewild Airport had a new name, JFK. It was one of the world's busiest airports, with $30 billion worth of goods passing through it annually. With the help of Henry Hill and Tommy DeSimone, it was Jimmy Burke's intention to get his hands on his own share of the wealth.
I think it was Henry Hill that used to say about Jimmy Burke that he loved being a thief, he loved to steal. He said that if you ever offered Jimmy Burke $1 billion, he'd turn you down and then he'd try to figure out a way to steal it from you. He just enjoyed being a crook that much.
Jimmy loved hijacking. And they always took care of the driver. Never killed any drivers. He always used to take the fucking license out. Cocksucker, we know who you are. You don't know who we are. Wave it on a black ice.
As a result of his generosity, the drivers whose trucks he hijacked named him Jimmy the Gent. He was known to stick a $50 note into the driver's pocket before letting him walk away. Jimmy the Gent was always generous to anyone who did him a favor and knew how to keep them on side.
Well, Jimmy Burke had a real talent for paying off whoever needed to be paid off. He knew how to grease the wheel so that it would make it easier for him to pull off whatever scam it was he had in mind.
Well, they were Irish. Irish to Irish. Now, back then, Jimmy had them all on the fucking payroll. From the district attorney, to the judges, to the cop walking the beat.
Because of his brutality and his ability to keep the police happy, Jimmy Burke was doing brilliantly as his business expanded. Variation in the tax rates in different states meant that a lot of money could be made by smuggling products such as cigarettes into New York. Burke, together with his old friend Remo, brought truckloads in for years and made a killing. In 1966, however, the FBI arrested Remo on narcotics charges. He faced life in prison, unless he made a deal with them. Remo realized he had no choice but to turn on his friend Jimmy Burke, and that's what he did. Burke had organized the biggest shipment of cigarettes yet, which would yield a profit of $200,000, but Remo had no interest in being involved this time. 2 days later, the FBI stopped the shipment on its way to New York.
The truck got pinched coming into New York. And Jimmy figured it out that, well, all the cops were on the payroll then. So the cops gave him all up. And then Jimmy killed him.
The police didn't have enough evidence to tie Jimmy Burke to the cigarettes. Now, Remo had broken the mafia's code of silence, earning him the death sentence. Burke and his friends threw Remo's body on waste ground between Roberts Lounge and JFK.
There was swamps out there. That was the funeral parlor, we used to call it. Funeral parlor. This guy's buried there, this guy's buried there, because it was swamps, you know, the worms ate them, you know what I mean? There was no DNA back in those days, so it was pretty easy.
Now that Remo was gone, Jimmy Burke was his own boss in Queens. However, he was only getting started, and before it was all over, many more bodies would join Remo's in Jimmy the Gent's graveyard. By the mid-1960s, Jimmy Burke was one of the richest and most powerful gangsters in New York. Not much went in or out of JFK Airport that Burke didn't know about. Together with Henry Hill, Burke began to plan bigger, more lucrative robberies, including a famous raid on Air France in 1967.
Burke and Hill simply walked into the cargo terminal at Air France and stole a significant amount of valuables and cash.
It was a good score back in those days. 60,000 was my end. You know what 60,000 was in 1967? A lot of fucking money.
With the money gained from robberies such as that of Air France, Jimmy Burke was consolidating his supremacy in Queens. Burke was on top, and nobody dared challenge him. That was until Billy Batts, a high-ranking Gambino member, got out of prison in 1971. Billy Batts was a made member of the Mafia, something that Jimmy Burke would never be due to his Irish heritage. Batts was now back in Queens, expecting Burke to pay him the respect he deserved.
Batts, you know, ran Queens. He was a Gambino. You know, he ran Queens. He did this 6-year stretch, and he come home, right? And Jimmy knew, you know, Jimmy read between the lines. This guy wanted his territory back. Meanwhile, Jimmy had the whole territory. But Batts, he's home a couple of days. It was right before Christmas. And he's at the bar having a party, you know what I mean? Those old cronies and shit. And Tommy walks in. His girlfriend Rosie, Crackling Rosie was to call her. So, you know, Billy knew him as a kid. So, you know, Billy always busted fucking balls, you know. And, you know, one thing led to another. They start arguing, right? Go get your fucking shine box, Tommy. You know, Tommy used to shine shoes as a kid. You know, now you cross the fucking line. So half an hour later, Tommy comes back. He went home to get a pistol. He had a pistol on him. Tommy walks back in the joint. Meanwhile, you know, we got him between us. And Jimmy just put his fucking head around him. Tommy starts just beating him with the fucking pistol, right? You know, all over the fucking joint.
The murder of Billy Batts was significant because Billy Batts was a made member of the Gambino crime family. And when non-members of an organized crime family, or even members of another organized crime family, if they don't have authorization from the leadership of the families and from the commission at the time, if they kill or if they even hit a member of another family, then the repercussions could be significant, to say the least.
Burke decided to put Batts' body somewhere it would never be found.
This friend of ours, Ralph Atlas, who was a big international bookmaker, big fucking ranch he had up here some fucking way around here. And we buried him there, right? It was cold, it was in December. So we, you know, it was a shallow grave we buried this motherfucker in. And then Ralph sold his fucking property for condos or some kind of fucking shit. So we had to go dig him up again. We threw him in the trunk of the fucking car. We buried him under Roberts.
Batts was one of the many corpses buried in Roberts' Lounge, and Jimmy Burke was lucky nobody linked him to Batts' disappearance. However, in 1975, his luck ran out when he was convicted on extortion charges and sentenced to 4 years in Atlanta Penitentiary. When Burke was released back onto the streets in 1979, he was in urgent need of money. A bookmaker called Marty Krugman had obtained information about an enormous sum of money that was lying in a Lufthansa storage area in JFK Airport. And before long, Burke would put together his biggest robbery yet.
Marty Krugman. So he had these guys that worked at Lufthansa. And one Sunday, we were having dinner at my house, or Marty's house. And I got the biggest score of a life, at millions and millions of dollars. He says, can you put this, Mike, slow the fuck down. Let me think about this.
Henry Hill knew that Jimmy Burke was the only one able for the job, so he brought Krugman to meet him. Burke detested Krugman, but was wise enough not to shoot the messenger.
Jimmy knew that I wasn't full of shit. Jimmy knew what I was talking about. He said, okay, don't worry about it. I'll put the crew together.
And so Jimmy Burke put together plans to rob the Lufthansa air terminal. And using an assortment of criminals that he'd dealt with before in Queens area, a lot of them that hung out at Robert's Lounge, they were able to pull off this multi-million-dollar heist, which at that time was the largest single heist in the history of the United States.
The robbers rounded up 9 employees working inside the building and herded them all to a second-floor cafeteria. There they were handcuffed and guarded by one of the hold-up men as the others looted the safe in the cargo terminal's high-value room. Authorities aren't saying much more than they believe this to be the largest robbery in American history and that the investigation continues.
Well, the robbery netted over $6 million in cash, and we were never able to determine the total amount of jewelry and other valuables that was stolen in the robbery. It was probably in excess of $1 million, at least.
They didn't know how much fucking money was taken. And it was $8 million. It wasn't $6 million like that. It was $8 million plus fucking boxes of fucking jewels and shit.
Now, the heist you would think was the greatest thing that ever happened to these guys, but as is often the case with a heist of that size, the fallout from the heist is often more trouble than it's worth.
The Lufthansa heist took place on a Sunday in December. The FBI and the New York City Police Department knew through their informants on Monday morning that it was the Burke crew that was responsible for the heist. There were so many informants operating out of Kennedy Airport or in that area and in the world of organized crime that it was no secret who was responsible.
They knew who the fuck did it. They knew he was all out of jail. I mean, the feds, the cops, every fucking law enforcement agency in the fucking world was on us.
Burke ordered his crew to destroy any evidence that would link them to the robbery. But the authorities found the getaway van they had used before they could destroy it.
It was leaked to the paper that one of the participants in a robbery was wearing a certain type of Adidas sneaker, and that a footprint was left in the van that was recovered. That was where they took the loot in this van that had been stolen. So I brought Burke over for some fingerprinting in my office, and when he walked into the office, he was wearing Adidas sneakers, and he looked down at the sneakers and he looked at me and gave me a wink.
Burke knew that the authorities were after his men, and he ordered them to keep quiet and lie low for a time.
In this case, there was so much money and so many people involved in the heist that Burke first put out the rule that nobody was supposed to spend their money because they didn't want the money to be traced immediately to the crew of criminals who'd pulled off the heist. So the idea was to lay low for a while. You lay low. You don't go out and spend the money in any kind of extravagant way that's going to call attention to yourself.
First of all, some of them were morons. Buying fucking brand new pink Cadillacs, buying fucking $25,000 mink coats for the girlfriends and shit.
The tabloids in New York had a field day. This was the largest robbery in history, so that in and of itself became the subject of a lot of media attention. And what began to happen, people who were involved with the robbery, who were potential cooperators with the government, began to be executed.
Ruthlessly, Jimmy Burke was determined to get rid of every single person who took part in the robbery.
Many of the people who we targeted as potential witnesses were executed, and we weren't able to develop their testimony. We really were coming up dry because most of the people who were potential witnesses ended up being dead.
One by one, Burke got rid of everyone who could tell the truth about the Lufthansa robbery until only he and Henry Hill remained. With the money from the robbery, Burke and Hill set up new ventures.
Well, we were able to track a significant amount of the money going into drug deals in Florida. Some of the other money was probably invested in some legitimate businesses, but from what we could see, a lot of the money was going into narcotics deals.
That was my introduction to heroin, and a whole lot of fucking money. A whole lot of fucking money. I mean, I ran out of banks to go and people to put safe deposit boxes, names in, you know, to stash the fucking cash.
Now that Jimmy Burke was involved in drugs, he was being closely watched, and the pressure was starting to show.
Jimmy used to take liquid speed. You know, he used to drink it. Liquid fucking speed. So he was really fucked up. That's when I started getting really fucking a little paranoid. And I was doing a little drugs at the time, a lot of drugs. It was a real kind of fucked up time of my life.
The police were now closing in on Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill. And in 1980, everything came crashing down.
Henry Hill was arrested for narcotics trafficking in a significant way by the Nassau County District Attorney's Office. In a sense, you could say that we sort of stole him from the Nassau County DA's office. The fact of the matter is that by the time he walked into my office late one Tuesday evening in May of 1980, Henry Hill had already decided that he was going to cooperate, and he was scared stiff. He thought he was about to be killed.
I knew it was over. I knew it was fucking over when it was over. You know, I lived by the sword, I would have died by the sword. I never would ever think about being a fucking rat. And I knew Jimmy would have locked my kids in a fucking refrigerator and threw it to Jamaica Bay. That's the kind of cocksucker he was. Because I knew where the fuck I was going. But I got him first, you know. My gun was quicker than his.
Henry Hill gave evidence against many of his comrades in the mafia, among them Jimmy Burke. Burke was sentenced to life in prison, where he died in April of 1996, at the age of 64. Henry Hill spent many years living under the Witness Protection Program.
I'm the dinosaur. That's it. I'm still alive. They're all fucking dead or doing life, you know, forever.
The authorities never recovered the majority of the money stolen in the Lufthansa heist. No other Irish gangster managed to achieve the same level of power within the mafia as Jimmy Burke. Some preferred to take on the mafia, even if it meant fighting to the death.
You know, it's widely speculated that you are also a target in this gangland war.
I'm in between both worlds, a square world and a street world, and I think I have trust from both sides. But I have no axe to grind, but if somebody wants to come after me, we're over here by the Celtic Club. I'm not hard to find.
In the 1970s, a war was fought for the control of the Cleveland rackets in Ohio. A war that ripped the city apart. On one side was the mafia, and on the other side was the Irishman known as the Celtic Warrior, Danny Greene.
He had a green flag in front of his house, and this was his image, and he felt that he could take over organized crime using his Irish roots.
But we never thought anything bad about it. He was just our dad. He was a very loving father, taught us so much about God and so much about being good to people.
Danny Greene was a hero to some. To others, he was another vicious criminal terrorizing the streets of Cleveland. A tough town full of tough men who worked on its docks and steel mills.
Cleveland was never really an Irish town in the same way that Chicago or New York or Boston were Irish towns. There were Irish in Cleveland. They came there to work on the Erie Canal, but the most they ever comprised of the population was about 10%.
Among those who made their way to Cleveland were a young couple, John Greene and Irene Fallon, from the west of Ireland. Shortly after moving, their first son Daniel was born, but their joy was short-lived. 3 days later, Irene died. His father left Danny at an orphanage where he was cared for by nuns until the age of 6. The years he spent in the orphanage taught Danny that life was tough, and by the time he left, he was more than able to look after himself. By this time his father had remarried, and he brought Danny to live with them. But he wasn't very welcome there, and his father had little interest in him, so he sent Danny to live with his grandfather in Collinwood, near Cleveland. Collinwood was a predominantly Italian neighborhood, surrounded by factories and steelyards. Danny's grandfather worked at night and slept during the day, leaving the boy to his own devices on the streets.
I think Danny was a bit of a loner, and so he was an easy target for kids that were very brave when they were in groups, when they were in gangs. They weren't so brave when they were by themselves, but Danny proved that he could handle himself, but it did develop into a hatred, really, of the Collinwood Italians, many of who, in years to come, would become the mafia soldiers who would be at war with Danny.
As a young man, Danny was stubborn, a trait that never left him. At this stage, he lacked direction in his life, and in 1951, Danny dropped out of school.
Danny eventually left Cleveland and joined the Marines, actually 2 years younger than he should have been. Did a stint in the Marine Corps, became a marksman with a rifle and pistol, and eventually came back to Cleveland to live, and eventually went to work on the docks on Lake Erie with the International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA.
If he had been unsettled before, he had now found his calling. In 1961, Danny was elected president of the local branch of the International Longshoremen's Association. Like in New York, the ILA ruled the waterfront and had strong ties to the mob.
By this time, by the 1960s and the 1970s, any sort of overriding structure for the Irish-American gangster was long gone. So you still had Irish-American gangsters, but they were operating within a totally different kind of universe. And in Cleveland, in particular, it was the Italian-Americans and Jews that controlled the underworld. And Danny Greene was, as an Irishman, pretty much on his own. He established power for himself as a union leader within the ILA on the waterfront, and that became the base of his power within the city, within the labor force, and also within the criminal underworld. And he started to exert an identity, his identity as an Irishman. He had a certain fascination, if not obsession, with his own Irishness, identifying very strongly with the mythology of the great Celtic warriors.
Danny Greene was living up to his name. He painted his office at the Union Green, drove a green car, and wore green clothes. It was a happy time in Danny's life. He met and married Nancy, a young woman from Cleveland.
We did have a lot of fun. There were many laughs, I would say. But his life became so involved with the longshoremen. Every union he became involved in. His life was not at home. His life was away from home. So really, I didn't know much of what he did because he didn't do anything at home. When he was home, he was a dad with the kids. Aside from that, he had to get up and go to work and just do what he did, and it might take him days, but it was his life, not our life, and we just were part of it.
Danny was spending a lot of time away from home. He was an important man on the waterfront, and he was making powerful friends.
Danny was out and about in the nightlife, meeting other union leaders and making contacts with organized crime figures. And Danny began hanging out with these guys, and it just became part of his lifestyle. He was becoming a mafia associate, maybe didn't even realize it, and he was also the president of the Longshoremen's Association. He wasn't too concerned with the members of the local because he was actually stealing from them. He was forcing them to donate, quote, donate, unquote, part of their paycheck to a supposed renovation fund, but really the money was just finding its way into Danny's pocket.
Danny enjoyed living the high life and moved his family into a big house in a wealthy suburb of Cleveland. But his lavish lifestyle began to attract attention. Questions were asked as to where his money came from. The Cleveland Plain Dealer published a series of articles relating to Danny Greene, and he was publicly questioned about the wealth he was amassing for himself. The newspapers covered the scandal, and Danny's work at the union was investigated.
Once that expose came out, it led to the fall of Danny with the Longshoremen's Union. He was actually arrested and convicted of embezzling union funds, and as part of his sentence, he was ordered not to work in the labor union industry. Danny was out from the ILA. At that point, he was unemployed, really, and that's when he started becoming more heavily involved in organized crime.
There was a notorious, well-known loan shark in Cleveland by the name of Shonder Burns. Shonder Burns was Jewish. He was the most prominent loan shark in all of the Cleveland underworld, and he hired Danny Greene as a bodyguard and a strong-arm man.
If Shonder Burns had a problem with a certain numbers operator, he might send Danny Greene out with a stick of dynamite to throw it in front of the guy's house. And that's when Danny had one of his first brushes with death. He had a stick of dynamite and the fuse was burning too fast. He went to toss it out of the car, but it went off before it got too far from the car and blew him out and injured an eardrum.
And it blew up, but he landed on the side of the freeway, and ironically it was like down a hill pretty far away, but behind our house. And he crawled up through the apple orchards and everything. It was by the back door, and his eyebrows and everything was all singed. He was totally, singed off. But it all grew back, and he would have never known it, ever.
Danny told police that the dynamite was thrown into his car in an assassination attempt. But privately, Danny was tired of being Shonder Burns' errand boy. Their relationship was deteriorating, and it was only going to get worse.
A conflict had developed between Danny and Shonder Burns over a $60,000 loan that had been provided for Danny to build a club that would stay open after legal hours and serve alcohol and so forth. And he got the money from Shonder Burns. Shonder Burns got it from a New York Mafia associate of his.
Their plan fell apart, but Danny had no intention of paying back the money. He told Burns to go to hell. This started a fierce and bloody battle between them.
Shonder finally decided that he was going to have to settle this once and for all, so he ordered some of his henchmen to place a bomb on Danny Greene's car. And Danny was driving around Collinwood and pulled into a gas station to get gas, and the young attendant came out and saw some wires sticking out from Danny's car. Danny Greene got out on his hands and knees on the ground and saw it was a bomb, disconnected the bomb from the car, and then took off the explosive from the detonation device. And at that time, Danny was very close with Ed Kovacic, who was a member of the Special Investigation Unit of the Cleveland Police Department. Eventually, he would become the police chief.
I got a call from Danny, and he said, "This is what I found." And he gave me a broken clothespin, a blasting cap and some wires, a timer. And I says, "Danny, where's the explosives?" He said, That's going back to the SOB that put them on my car.
Danny was very lucky that he survived this attempt on his life. There was enough C4 explosive in the bomb to end him. From that moment on, Danny Greene decided that it was a case of kill or be killed. During the 1970s, Danny Greene's power in the criminal underworld had been steadily increasing. The attempt on his life had come too close for comfort, and he needed to take action against the man behind it, Shonder Burns. It was time to get revenge. Burns had to go.
So one night in 1976, Shonder Burns was coming out of one of his favorite bar restaurants. He went to get in his car, which was parked near the restaurant, and the car blew up.
Shonda Burns' body was torn in two.
Both his legs are blowed off. That man will never walk no more long as he lives.
People were in Irish church at St. Malachy's on West 25th. People were coming out of services, and boom, parts of Sean came down on them. I knew Danny did it, although we could never prove it.
Danny had killed one of the top mobsters in Cleveland and got away with it.
Despite the threat he made to the police officer, there wasn't enough evidence to indict him. The investigation did not lead in that direction, but everyone, especially in the organized crime circles here in Cleveland, they knew who was responsible.
Danny may have been building a name for himself on the streets, but his private life was falling apart. He moved out of his family home and back to the streets he grew up on.
At this point now, as we're getting into the mid-70s, Danny moved by himself to Collinwood, Waterloo Road in Collinwood, and he would live in an apartment building there. And he had a very young girlfriend. Danny was in his early 40s, I believe, and he had a girlfriend who was 19 or 20 years old.
Danny set himself up in Collinwood and began to imitate the major gangsters of the 1920s, who always looked after their neighborhood and gave generously to the poor.
He would treat the people in the neighborhood nice. He really did. The girls, the people that were hard up, and every Thanksgiving he bought 50 20-pound turkeys, gave them away. Every Christmas, 50 20-pound turkeys, gave them away.
Like I said, I don't eat steaks anymore because we used to give so much food out, drive around the cars, and my sister and I, my brothers, we'd go up to the houses and give people turkeys and hams and steaks and lobsters because their families were less fortunate. And we probably didn't even eat that well half the time. I think this said he was a very giving man. I guess the Robin Hood of Collinwood.
Basically, he walked around most of the time with very little money in his pocket. He gave most of what he got, he gave it away. And he died penniless.
Danny now needed all the friends he could find. The killing of Shonda Burns had angered the mafia, and Danny was now marked for death.
One of the strengths of that group is if you hurt a member of that group, you're dead. You're gone.
After the death of Shonda Burns, this bombing war only heated up more and more, and there were a number of tit-for-tat bombing attacks in which the Italians were trying to take out Danny Greene.
A contract was put out on Danny, and they decided to hit him at his home.
They sent two hitmen to go and put bombs on Danny Greene's apartment building. Well, one of the bombs went off and demolished the building. Danny and his girlfriend walked away. The other bomb that they had didn't go off.
When they blew up the building and he was inside of it, they had the second bomb right there. If that would have gone off, it was attached to a 5-gallon can of gas. And it was military dynamite. If that would have gone off, a lot of the neighborhood would have gone with it.
Danny Greene and his neighborhood were lucky, but if the mafia thought his neighbors would turn on him, they were wrong. In fact, they helped him clear up the debris. Danny wouldn't be forced out of his home, and if the mafia wanted war, they'd get it.
After the bombing of his apartment building, Danny Greene came back, and after the rubble was cleared away, he had 2 trailers set up, and he would live in one, and the other one would be his office. And now that he knew that he was at war, he would now make his organization become known as the Celtic Club, with the Irish tricolor fluttering overhead, and the Celtic Club would be basically Danny's Irish Mafia.
Danny used the Celtic Club to attract more supporters. He was now making money on gambling ventures and racketeering all over the city. He wouldn't be satisfied until he had complete control of Cleveland's underworld. Danny was about to form his own army.
He would sit down on Waterloo, bare-chested with a Celtic cross, and he had a gun on his ankle. He had an ankle holster. And he'd sit out there just daring these guys to kill him. And I told him, "You're going to get killed, Danny. You're going to get killed."
He was now at war with the mafia. So many bombings were taking place that Cleveland was dubbed the bombing capital of the country. But no matter how hard the mafia tried, Danny was always one step ahead.
But I have no axe to grind, but if somebody wants to come after me, we're over here by the Celtic Club. I'm not hard to find.
And much like Legs Diamond in a previous generation, Danny Greene's legend grew within the city. Each time he survived one of these bombing attacks, his reputation became more notorious. And of course, this would only get the Italians more riled up and more determined to take Danny Greene out. But they weren't able to do it. And in the meantime, Danny Greene was eliminating certain high-level members of the mafia in Cleveland. And this became a national directive within the mafia that Danny Greene needed to be taken out. And they had a surveillance team that was following Danny Greene around. But what the surveillance team and the mafia didn't know was Danny Greene was also operating as an informant for the FBI.
Multiple assassination attempts failed, and Greene put it all down to the luck of the Irish.
As Danny Greene was building his career with the longshoremen, he was visited by some FBI agents who were interested in him because he was sort of getting on the radar screen of organized crime. They started talking to him, and eventually they realized that he was the type of character that they could use for information. And Danny Greene liked playing the role of being an FBI informant. And as Danny Greene became more entrenched in the organized crime business in Cleveland, he became more valuable to the FBI.
By leaking information to the FBI was in turn leaking information to Danny Greene about assassination attempts they were hearing about, so that Danny Greene was able to stay one step ahead of the competition.
He gave himself a code name, not the FBI didn't give it to him. He called himself Mr. Patrick, after his beloved saint, I'm sure, St. Patrick. In his own mind, he was using the FBI. The FBI wasn't using Danny. Danny was using the FBI to further his cause.
Danny Greene had been playing both sides for years. His involvement with the FBI stretched back to his ILA days. Danny used the FBI to put his enemies behind bars and keep himself out of jail. The mafia needed to change tactics to get to Greene, and they eventually came up with a plan to gather information on him by bugging his girlfriend's telephone. In a recorded telephone conversation, they discovered that Danny had a dental appointment. They knew the date, time, and location. The mafia had all the information they needed, and this time there would be no mistakes. They brought in 2 mafia hitmen from outside town to do the job, Ray Ferrito and Ronnie Carabia.
Danny Greene arrived for his dental appointment at Brainerd Place Medical Building here. He pulled his car in, parked right about here. Ray Ferrito and Ronnie Carabia were watching from the intersection for him to come out of the dental appointment. In the meantime, they were able to park the bomb car right next to Danny's car. They watched for Danny to come out. When Danny got to his car, went to open the door, they detonated the bomb car by remote control. The bomb car exploded, and Danny Greene was killed instantly.
When your supervisor comes up and tells you, did you hear the news, Danny Greene just was killed? It's just like, you know, oh my God, what? I thought about the kids. I thought about how am I going to tell, what, you know, family. You just don't know what to think.
After at least 7 assassination attempts, the Celtic warrior was dead. He lived and died by the sword. But even in death, Danny would have the last laugh on the Cleveland Mafia. Witnesses emerged who had seen the car that was used by his killers. The car was found, and the owner and those involved were also located. This prompted a crackdown on the Italian Mafia's activity in Cleveland and throughout the United States. It would be Danny Greene's biggest legacy.
The goal that he had to eliminate the Mafia from being in control of the rackets occurred because his death sparked so many investigations, and the investigations in turn sparked so many men to betray their criminal organization and their criminal associates and go to work for the government and provide information that would in turn create bigger cases that would take down organized crime, not only locally but regionally and nationally.
Danny Greene wasn't the most powerful mobster who ever lived. He wasn't the wealthiest nor the cleverest. But his story embodies the spirit of the Irish mobsters in America.